going to talk about Petrus Christus, who was a painter who was recorded in Bruges between 1444 and 1473. Like so many of these artists, we do not know his birth date. We do know that he was born in Barl in the North Netherlands, and he died in Bruges in 1473. The first document we have on Petrus Christus is the document that tells us that he purchased citizenship. This is in the Portersboeken, where they would record people who became citizens. And in 1444, it says that Petrus Christus, the son of Peter, born in Barl, purchased citizenship on the 6th of July in order to be a painter. And it tells us that he was sponsored by Huis van der Donk. Now, Barl is in North Brabant. It's just over today's border between Belgium and the Netherlands. And we know of Netherlandish artists who come down from the north to, well, what about Klaus Sluiter? Klaus Sluiter came from Haarlem. He worked in Brussels, and then he went as far south as Burgundy. Petrus Christus doesn't go that far. He comes from Barl, and he settles in Bruges, in Flanders. Now, Bruges was one of the most important trading centers in Europe. It had international banking. It had merchants from Spain, Italy, Germany, just all over. So this would have been a very cosmopolitan place and a place where you might find a lot of people wanting art. So Petrus Christus settles there in order to be a painter. Now that document tells us something else about Petrus Christus. One thing, in order to become a painter in Bruges, he would have to become a citizen of Bruges, because only Bruges citizens can be masters of a crafts guild and can sell their work in Bruges. And this is true for other cities. They didn't want people just sort of wandering in from the outside and making money and then wandering off again and using that money somewhere else. They wanted to support their own citizens. And so to be a master of the craft guild, you had to become both a citizen and a master in the city in which you were working. Okay. He wasn't born in Bruges. So how does he become a citizen? Well, there's 4 ways you can become a citizen. One is be born in Bruges. Another is marry someone who is a Bruges citizen. And another is to live for a year and a day in Bruges. Presumably, craftsmen would come in from someplace else and work as journeymen for a year and a day before trying to set up their own business. And then the 4th way, and this is the way that Petrus Christus did it, was to pay a citizenship fee. Now, the fee was a pretty hefty sum. So if you had been living in Bruges, you would not pay that fee. So that tells us something else about Petrus Christus. It tells us that he had not been living in Bruges for a year and a day. Okay, why is that important? Because Petrus Christus is very much a follower of Jan van Eyck. He's been influenced by the work of Jan van Eyck. And it used to be believed that he was an apprentice to Jan van Eyck and had inherited the workshop. However, when you look at this document of citizenship, you realize that it can't be. And this was one of the discoveries that Joel Upton, who was a professor at Amherst and got his PhD from Bryn Mawr in 1972, I think, at any rate, he wrote his dissertation on Petrus Christus, and in there he discusses this particular issue. If Petrus Christus had been living in Bruges and working as Jan van Eyck's apprentice, well, what? Jan van Eyck died in 1441. And here's Petrus Christus setting himself up in 1444. If he was living there when Jan van Eyck died, he could have just continued to live for a while, perhaps, and gotten his citizenship free. He might have had to work for someone else until that year and a day was finished. But it certainly would have been cheaper than purchasing citizenship. So it seems logical that the influence of Jan van Eyck is because of Petrus Christus studied Jan van Eyck's paintings. He looked at them. Let's look at some work by Petrus Christus. He signed and dated about 6 works of art. So that's very handy for us. We know then that those works were created by him, and we know when they were created. This is a portrait of a Carthusian monk, and it is signed and dated. And as you'll notice, right there on this band at the bottom, which has Petrus Christus' signature. It says Petrus Christus made me, and you'll notice that the Christus is made up of the Greek letters of the word Christ, which is chi. It's maybe chi rho iota. So it says Petrus Christus made me. As though the person was speaking to us. Well, you remember that Jan van Eyck did the same thing. He would sign portraits sometimes. Jan van Eyck made me, as though the person in the portrait was speaking to us. So it's quite probable that Petrus Christus did see some portraits by Jan van Eyck and adopted this as well as other things. One of the really interesting things about this painting is if you look at that band or ledge that has the signature on it, there is a fly. And presumably, you want to go over and brush the fly away. Why is it sitting on that painting? Why is it sitting on that ledge? Only, of course, you can't brush it away because it's actually a painted fly. It's a painting. It's what we call trompe l'oeil, or fool the eye. It's trying to show you that he is such an excellent artist that he can fool you into believing that that is really a fly. And there's probably a symbolic meaning for that too. Flies, of course, are associated with death. They lay their eggs in dead matter. They, gravitate to corpses, and they live a very short life. So the fly can be a symbol of death, of decay, of the transitoriness of life. It's an emblem that we would refer to perhaps as a memento mori. Remember death. Remember, man, that thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. It's to remind people that we're only in this life for a little while, and you have to think about your spiritual well-being. And the Carthusians were a very austere order. They were supposed to pray virtually all the time, rather than work and pray the way the Benedictines did. Now, what Carthusian would have himself portrayed with a portrait? Well, of course, we don't know who this is. Maybe it was an abbot of a Carthusian monastery. Maybe it was a notable Carthusian. It's been suggested that it could be Denis the Carthusian. or Dionysius of Louvain, as he's sometimes called, who was a theologian at this time and just wrote a tremendous amount of theological works. It's also been suggested that this was Saint Bruno. Now, not an actual portrait of Saint Bruno, but Saint Bruno was the founder of the Carthusian order. And it used to be that there was a halo, sort of a gold circle, around the head of this Carthusian monk. And then, as late as 1992, I believe, it was discovered that this was not original to the painting. It had been put on with a compass, and the point of the compass had actually destroyed paint around the area of the right temple. And so it couldn't have been original. You would have put your markings for your halo on before you painted your painting. You wouldn't destroy part of your painting to do that. And so it was suggested that perhaps the halo was added in the 16th century. No. So then it was suggested that the halo may have been added in the early 17th century, about the time that St. Bruno became a saint, that he was canonized. In which case, this could have been a portrait of someone else, and they just, transformed it into a saint by putting the halo on it. Well, the halo has been removed, and you see it now a little closer to what it would have been originally. That painting was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and so was this one. This, we don't know quite what to call it. Sometimes it's called St. Eligius, and sometimes it's called a goldsmith, or a goldsmith in his workshop. Once again, this has an inscription, and I have it here both in the Latin, so you can see how it looks, and the translation. Master Petrus Christus made me in the year 1449. And this is inscribed, as you can see, on what seems to be the side of a workbench that projects into the picture and sort of separates us from the scene. And of course, it's part of the scene. And what you're seeing is a goldsmith in his workshop. It seems like he's weighing out something. And there's a very well-to-dressed, aristocratic or wealthy couple with a woman wearing beautiful brocade, and either her husband or her fiancé, someone who feels that he can put his arm around her, is with her. It's been suggested they're buying either a marriage ring or they're buying a gift for the bride. Now, there's a few things that you're going to notice about Petrus Christus' style. For one thing, most of his forms seem very simplified, very generalized. This is something that is certainly different than Jan van Eyck. He's not putting in all of those tiny little details that give us the sense of the actual textures of, everything. Heads, for example, seem to be, your book likes the word stereometric, which means the measure of volumes. So these volumetric, stereometric, somewhat egg-shaped heads are part and parcel of Petrus Christus' style. And you'll also notice this, for example, in the drapery folds. They're broad. They make you feel that the figure is solid and weighty, but there's not a tremendous amount of little detail in his work. So you have these more generalized forms. Well, let's talk about the possible function of this work. We don't have a document that tells us where it originally was placed. One of the suggestions that has been made, and sometimes pretty widely accepted, is that perhaps it was made for the Bruges Goldsmiths Guild. But the question is this a sacred picture showing Saint Eligius, the patron saint of goldsmith, created to be an altarpiece or a painting in the chapel of the Goldsmiths Guild? Or is it a secular picture showing a contemporary 15th century goldsmith at work that, well, maybe it was placed in the guild hall? Or maybe it was commissioned by a goldsmith, maybe the dean of the guild, for his own home. We don't know. And we're not even sure whether the function is a sacred function or a secular function because of the various suggestions about what might be going on in this picture. And so I listed some of them. Traditionally, this was called Saint Eligius, who is the patron saint of goldsmiths. The actual Saint Eligius was a martyr. He refused to create a pagan idol. And because he said, I'm a Christian, and then he was killed, I believe, under the persecutions of Diocletius. But of course, he's not shown as a 4th century classical figure. He's shown as though he were 15th century goldsmith. Even if it were Saint Eligius, you would not show him in what we might call an archaeological sense, because there were no archaeologists in the 15th century in the Netherlands. You would show him as a contemporary goldsmith. And then it's been suggested that maybe it's a portrait of an individual goldsmith. It's also been suggested that he's just more a generic goldsmith, and that it's just showing the goldsmith at work. And if so, then this is neither a sacred picture of a saint or a portrait of a particular person. This then would be one of, if not the first genre scene. Now, what is a genre scene? A genre scene is everyday people doing everyday things. So it's secular activities, it's everyday activities. And here it's showing a goldsmith in his shop conducting business. And then another idea has been that this could be a marriage picture. And it may in some way combine some of these, that it's a secular genre scene, but has reference to marriage. Because they're referring here to the married or about to be married, they assume, couple with the goldsmith. And also the band, this great sash that you see on his workshop, has sometimes been called a marriage girdle or a marriage sash. Sometimes when you look at pictures of weddings in the 15th century, such as there's a painting, for example, by Roger van der Weyden. It's in Antwerp, and it shows the Seven Sacraments. And when it's showing the sacrament of marriage, it's showing the couple with their hands together, and the priest has wrapped a band around their hands, binding them together. So, it could be marriage within that context, or it could be, if it is Saint Eligius, it could be Saint Eligius, the patron saint here, is helping out a couple about to get married or who is married. So you could have a marriage meaning within the painting. Now, this has certain references to Jan van Eyck's work. One of them, of course, you see the convex mirror, which is propped up here and reflecting, presumably it's reflecting through the window what's going on the street outside the goldsmith's workshop. There's all of these still life objects, these inanimate objects, which would be appropriate for the goldsmith studio, but also remind us of those still life objects that you see in paintings by Jan van Eyck. You'll remember, for example, vessels in paintings of the Virgin Mary, and all sorts of other things. For example, This is a little painting down here, you see in the corner. It's only about 6 inches high. It's really about the size of a postcard, really. It's in the Detroit Institute of Art, and it's had a kind of long history of attributions. At one time, it was called a Petrus Christus, and then they cleaned it. And when they cleaned it, they said, oh my goodness, this is so much better than Petrus Christus. It must be a painting by Jan van Eyck. And, you look at the actual painting and it looks really good. There's a lot of detail in it. And so many articles have been written about it as a Van Eyck. However, there's one problem. There is a date on it, which is 1442, which is the year after Jan van Eyck died. So people who believe it's by Jan van Eyck say, well, it probably was left unfinished in his studio and somebody else, they used to say Petrus Christus, but somebody else finished it up and put that date on. Or it was in the studio and, when they sold it to someone, they put the date on posthumously. The other idea is that it's somebody who is a close follower of Jan van Eyck, maybe even following one of his designs. At any rate, it's certainly an Eyckian picture, and as you can see, this is St. Jerome in his study, and he has all of these still life objects, we would call them. He has the books. He's the patron saint of scholars. He's the person who translated the Bible into Latin. And he has other objects in his room, which we've actually seen these in other paintings by Jan van Eyck. Looks like a little whisk broom and another one of these clear vessels, and there's been a whole article, there's been articles written about this, particularly by Edwin Hall, discussing the symbolism of this, and he believes that it may be a portrait of Cardinal Albergati, who, as you remember, Jan van Eyck painted his portrait. And perhaps this is the Cardinal as the saint. At any rate, it gives us an example of Eyckian still life objects, and they're on shelves rather like our goldsmith shop here. And here we're looking at the details so you can see them. He has things that would be something you would sell to a wealthy secular person, such as rings, jewelry, and he has things that could be liturgical vessels, maybe a monstrous or a reliquary, for example. Coral was believed to ward off evil. So you see both a branch of coral and a string of beads, which perhaps are they supposed to be a kind of proto-rosary before the rosary was standardized? They could be that, prayer beads. And some of them seem to be made out of coral. So you have a lot of beautiful objects there. And that follows the Eyckian tradition. Then we want to look at that convex mirror. Of course, we saw that in the Arnolfini double portrait. And here we see not the backs of the figures, but if we could turn and look out, as we're seeing at the left side of the workshop, presumably there's a window there, and we're seeing out into the street. And here are two men looking inward. You wonder, are they looking into the shop? Rather than just passing on the street, because they're certainly facing in. And then, of course, you see, a Netherlandish city with the very closely packed houses. Now, these two young men are fashionably dressed. One of them is holding a falcon. And hawking, when you would use a falcon or a hawk for hunting, was often considered to be an aristocratic activity. They even had rules about what kind of bird of prey different people could use. It was very codified. The king could use one thing, I think like deer or hawk. Another type of bird of prey could be used by people of different status. So who are these people? Well, maybe they're potential customers. After all, we have this young couple in the workshop, picking out some jewelry. So maybe these people come in and buy something. However, there's been another suggestion. Someone has looked very, very closely at the mirror, and on this edge that's right up next to the frame, you can see on the far right, there's a series of cracks. Rather than a perfect mirror, Petrus Christus has painted a flawed mirror. And so it's suggested that rather than just being, hey, look what we see outside, that this may actually have some kind of symbolic meaning, that perhaps it is referring to people who are filled with worldly vanity, and they're going out and hawking, and they're not working hard, and they're not thinking about spiritual things, and that somehow in this case the mirror is cracked, that this is a kind of vanitas image. I'll let you be the judge. It's always fun to look at details and to see how the artist has created the illusion of light shining on the surfaces. And certainly, even though we said Petrus Christus does much more generalized figures and generalized draperies, he does create the illusion that light, for example, is shining on the gold brocade that the young woman is wearing. And here I have a comparison, a detail of brocade of Jan van Eyck and a detail of Petrus Christus. As marvelous as the Petrus Christus looks just on its own, when you bring it up to a Jan van Eyck, of course, Jan van Eyck is much richer, much more detailed, and you always feel like you get magnifying glasses and then go further and further into it. Petrus Christus is, you could say, imitating the idea of light shining off fabric. I'm showing you two pictures of a painting by Petrus Christus that's in the National Gallery in Washington. This one is not dated, and it is not signed. I'll tell you why in a minute. I'm showing you two. But this is not dated, it's not signed, but the style is so completely Petrus Christus that nobody doubts this painting. It's universally attributed to Petrus Christus. One of these pictures is before Restoration, and one of these pictures is after Restoration. And I'll give you a hint, as it were. Look down at the Christ child. When they restored this work of art, they realized that this sort of golden, I must call it a golden dish, almost a kind of golden paten here below the Christ child, was a later addition. And that Petrus Christus had actually painted the Christ child lying on the edge of Mary's mantle, marriage garment. Now, there was a difference in quality of these images. The detail that was taken after Restoration, I've taken pictures of this before and after, but the one after Restoration is from a detail of a handheld, no special lighting camera. And that may be why you're not, it may not look as clear, but that's just trying to show you how the child was actually placed. Okay, now this is still, in some sense, a Bridgetine nativity, and you'll remember that Saint Bridget of Sweden, or Birgitta of Sweden, went to the Holy Land, And in Bethlehem, at the Grotto of the Nativity, she had a vision of the birth of Christ, which was described in her book of Revelations, the Revelations of Santa Birgitta. And she said that she saw the Virgin Mary kneel down, and suddenly she knew she couldn't figure out by what means. It was just miraculous. 1 minute the child was inside Mary, and 1 minute the child was lying on the ground, naked and shining. So when we see the Christ child not laid in the manger, as the Bible talks about, but lying on the ground, we say that this is a Brigittine nativity. Sometimes, of course, the child will have rays of light, or even this golden platter. Reminds you of a patent of the host, perhaps. But in this case, the golden oval is a later addition. And yet, it's still the Christ child lying on the ground, or almost the ground, because he's lying on the mantle. And here you see him again with the angels surrounding him. Now, the angels are wearing very specific ecclesiastical vestments. These are the vestments, the garments, that would be worn by sub-ministers at a Mass. In other words, if you had several priests who were celebrating the Mass, maybe a solemn high Mass, perhaps the first Mass of a new priest. But there's no angel wearing the vestment that the celebrant, the priest who actually does the consecration, would be wearing. And so it has been suggested that Christ is the celebrant, that he is the priest as well as the sacrifice in his first Eucharist, his first Mass. That coming into the world, of course, is a sacrifice for God. And Christ is the sacrificial host or victim. That the host, of course, is also the bread, and the bread is the body of Christ. Now, we've talked about the influence of Jan van Eyck, and we'll mention that again whenever you're talking about Petrus Christus. You certainly are talking about the influence of Jan van Eyck. But he's obviously looked at other works by other artists. And it's possible, of course, that he didn't see these original works, that he saw another work either by that artist or by someone copying the artist. In this case, Roger van der Weyden. And that detail of the Christ child lying on the edge of Mary's mantle. But we've seen this in the Bladelen Nativity by Roger van der Weyden. Mary is wearing a white garment, but she also has a deep, rich blue mantle. And it is on this mantle that the Christ child is lying. It's almost as though, yes, I want to show you the Brigittine nativity, but I don't want to put Christ on the ground. It almost seems sacrilegious. So we're having him on Mary's mantle, which separates him from the ground. Another device that comes out of Roger van der Weyden is the historiated archway, which forms the foreground of a painting, and through it we see the scene. Now, in this particular example from Roger van der Weyden, which is, as you can see, the baptism of Christ here on your right, the figures are overlapping the archway. So they're actually coming forth, and then we're looking back over the landscape of the River Jordan. However, we've also seen other paintings. We've seen the Mary altar, or the Mary Flores altar by Roger van der Weyden, and we've seen the other scenes in this, the St. John the Baptist altarpiece that is in Berlin. So this idea of having painted scenes carved as though they were the carved in the archivolt, or the voussoirs of the archway. The archivolt would be the molding around the arch. The voussoir would be the blocks and the keystone that make up the archway. So it's as though there's little stone carvings on it, and also, as you can see, figures in the jambs, the columns at the side of the archway. Well, Petrus Christus has borrowed that, and we'll take a closer look at his archway and the different scenes. We call it historiated because it has a story, a history, as you will, of these little different scenes going around. But first, let's look at something else that's very, very important about Petrus Christus. You see the diagram, and you see the painting, and you'll notice that there is, in many of these blocks and the edge of the roof, a consistent one-point linear perspective. Now, some of you will remember from survey class that this mathematical perspective, or this linear perspective, was invented or discovered, depending on how you think of it, by Filippo Brunelleschi in Florence in the early years of the 15th century. We talked about Jan van Eyck, and he has what we sometimes call an optical perspective. It's not a consistent one-point perspective. It seems to be, a lot of times the top part of the picture will meet at one vanishing point, and the bottom part will meet at another. We often say it's optical. It looks real, it looks right, but it's not mathematically figured out. Petrus Christus seems to be the first artist to use linear perspective in Northern Europe. And so, we want to know, how did he know about it? Well, we don't know. One idea is that Petrus Christus may have gone down to Italy. There is a document in Urbino that talks about a painter from Flanders named Piero at the court of Urbino. Could this be Petrus Christus? Piero is the Italian for Peter. And, of course, Petrus is Peter in Latin. It's possible, but we can't prove it. But some way, he learned linear perspective, and somewhere around the middle of the century, perhaps, he brought that to Flanders. Now, we said that the arch motif came from Roger van der Weyden. I don't mean it's copied exactly. It's just the idea of using the archivolts as a place to put these little carvings, little scenes. Of course, they're painted, they're illusionistic, they're not really stone, they just look like it. And you'll see, here's something that Roger van der Weyden didn't do. Up in the corners, in the spandrels, you see two illusionistic carvings of fighting men, warriors, about to kill each other. Who are they? What are they doing there? Well, we don't know if they are anybody particular. We just assume that they're generic fighters, generic warriors, and possibly represent sin and violence that is in the world. But we can get much more specific about what is going on with the scenes that are shown. And I'll show you that in the next image. But if you look down below, you see Adam and Eve on either side of the doorway. They are shown as jam statues, and part of their story is, and the story of their sons is shown in the archway itself. You'll remember that Adam brought sin into the world. Adam and Eve brought sin and death into the world by their disobedience, their original sin. And Christ, as the new Adam, redeems the sin of the first Adam. And of course, here is the Nativity with Christ entering the world for the first time to redeem the sins of the original first parent, the first Adam. And here I have a little detail so you can see Eve a little closer. And you'll notice that there's a kind of wall that separates Mary and Joseph, the Holy Family, and Christ, from these figures in the background. And you can have one figure is leaning over the wall. Maybe he's trying to get a better look. And there are some others behind these window openings in the stable. Presumably, these are the shepherds who have come to adore the Christ child. If not, then they are people from the world who are, in one case, curious about it, or in another, maybe just ignoring it. And here we want to see a little more detail of some of that fake stone, as it were, fake statues. Adam and Eve are shown in the same poses that Jan van Eyck used in the Ghent altarpiece. And of course, the Ghent altarpiece is a very large altarpiece in Ghent. Ghent is very close to Bruges. Petrus Christus undoubtedly saw it. And then at the bottom of these columns, or engaged columns, you have little men who are all bent over, and they're trying to hold up the bottom of the column rather than it resting just on the ground. Of course, when we have a figure that's, a substitute column, we call them caryatids. Here they're just the base. But they seem to represent perhaps sinful mankind, bowed down with the burden of original sin. Now, one thing I find very interesting about this is Joseph's sandals. They're called pattens. We've seen these before, haven't we? We've seen something similar to this before. We've seen the patterns in the Arnolfini double portrait. And they're just basically carved out of wood with a leather strap going around, and this is what someone would slip on over their leather or cloth indoor shoes, as it were, to wear outside to protect their shoes and their feet from the mud and the muck and the dirt in the streets. And here we see that Joseph has taken off his pattens when he's standing in the stable of the Nativity. Now, to be perfectly frank, the last place you'd want to take off your pattens is when you go into a stable. I mean, let's face it, there could be some excrement lying around on the floor of the stable. Well, there certainly isn't in this stable. It's, beautifully clean. But it's not some place that you would normally take your pattens off, like you might go inside, but not in a stable. So one wonders, they are very prominently placed. Could this refer to the idea of holy ground, that the site of the Nativity is sacred? It is now, it's been sanctified. It is now holy ground. And of course, the reference for that is from Exodus. Try to remember the exact verse. It's Exodus 3. God speaks to Moses from the burning bush, and he tells Moses to remove his sandals or his shoes, depending on your translation, because he is on holy ground. He says, take off your shoes. You are on holy ground. Could that be the meaning of these patents? Now, you'll remember that in the Arnolfini double portrait, Panofsky suggested this meaning for the patents that Mr. Arnolfini had right beside him on the ground. And he suggested that this referred to the holy ground, that because as Panofsky believed, it was a wedding, a sacrament. One of the things that I've wondered about Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini double portrait and other paintings, we don't have all the paintings that Jan van Eyck or any other artist of this time created. Quite possibly, could Jan van Eyck have painted a nativity? And could Petrus Christus' nativity in some way reflect that? For example, could Jan van Eyck, or perhaps a theological advisor for this putative lost nativity, have suggested the idea, or have thought up the idea, of Moses removing his patens to signify holy ground? Now, that's all speculation, but if it would be so, it would make a certain amount of sense. Petrus Christus could be borrowing that Eyckian motif not from the Arnolfini double portrait, but from a nativity that was placed in a church where he could see it, rather than somebody's private possession. And could Jan van Eyck have developed this symbolism, which then he uses not only in the sacred works, his religious pictures, but he borrows some of that, some of those objects that have a sacred meaning in a sacred context, and used them in the Arnolfini double portrait. The mirror, for example, referring to Mary as the mirror without spot, the speculum sine macula. Could it refer to the virginity of the bride or the woman? Could the sandals say that there is something sacred about that space? Speculation. I can't say it definitely. Okay, I said I couldn't remember what verse. I have it written down here. It's from Exodus 3:5. One of these very, very beautiful paintings by Petrus Christus, and I think even in the reproduction you can see that it almost glows, and the colors are just beautiful. You have sort of the different tones of grays and browns in the stone and the wood, and then you have the bright garments of Mary and this green wall hanging. It just is a beautiful light-filled picture. Is the Virgin and Child in a chamber, in a domestic interior? This is in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. And it can be considered to be a kind of holy family because, of course, you have Mary and the Christ child in the foreground. And if you look into the background, you see Joseph entering. Is he coming home from work? And so this could almost be the home of a prosperous, middle class, but well-to-do 15th century Netherlandish family. With the bed and the chandelier, and you have this sense of space opening from one room into another. You have clarity of space. Christus uses linear perspective here on an angle, with the vanishing point being in the green pillow that you see in the settle. And you also see one room opening into another, and then the windows opening into the exterior, into the outside. And when you can see that scene, a little bit of landscape, a little bit of townscape, a little walled garden. She's the hortus conclusus, the garden enclosed. We even see the fruit on the windowsill. Of course, fruit. Several meanings there. Could refer to the forbidden fruit and Christ as the new Adam who redeems the sin of the original Adam. or it could refer to Christ as the fructus ventris, the fruit of Mary's womb, and perhaps to her miraculous fecundity, that a virgin could conceive and bear a child. But it's all very subtle. It's not screaming at you, oh, I'm a symbol here. I said this was a light-filled interior, and you certainly have the sense that light is coming from the window. It's shining on Mary. It's shining on the Christ child. It's shining on parts of the room, and Joseph is coming in and has opened the door, and there's this large opening here, and there's light shining in that back room. I want to say something about that back room and the views out. In some ways, this reminds me of a Peter de Hoek. Some of you know some Baroque art, and you may know that in the 17th century, Dutch painters would often paint genre paintings with domestic interiors. And they would sometimes show one room opening into another, and then maybe opening into the outside with the sun coming in. When we talk about this as kind of a Baroque device, but here it is in Petrus Christus. In this case, it's a sacred context. But you could almost think that it's, take away one attribute, I'll talk about that in a minute, and you could say it's a woman and her baby, and her husband's coming home from work. So this is a very actually a relatable Holy Family. You could identify with them. Presumably they have, middle-class values of, caring for the child themselves and for working hard. And so you can imagine the person who owned this, being able not only to say their devotions in front of them, but to use it as a kind of exemplar in their own life. Now, I want to talk some more about that light. The light could have several reasons. One, of course, it is a wonderful example of Netherlandish naturalism. As you know, Jan van Eyck and other Netherlandish artists were so interested in trying to show you how light shines in the world and how it shines on different surfaces. But the light also has a spiritual meaning. Christ, of course, is called the light of the world, and there are many verses in the Bible that talk about him as the light of the world, or as the true light. Here from the first chapter of John, verse 9, that, the grammar's a little different in the 16th century, so we'd probably say he or who. They're talking about Christ. That was the true light, which enlighteneth every man that cometh into this world. Now, you'll notice that there's a book open right in front of the Christ child and Mary. And we sometimes talk about the reading virgin or the reading Christ child. And we think that that has a reference to Christ as the Word. In Latin, the verbum, in Greek, the logos. And of course, this comes from the Gospel of St. John again, the very first verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then further on, he says, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. A absolute reference to the incarnation. And of course, here you see Mary, the vessel that gave birth to the Christ child, the vehicle of the incarnation, with her infant child. Well, how do you know that this isn't just any child? And any mother and any father, because of, as I said, there's one attribute that Christ has that tells us exactly who he is. There's this little baby holding this crystalline orb, sphere, and a cross. So the cross is rising out of that orb. And of course, you'll remember the orb and cross that Jan van Eyck's Christ child held in the Roland Madonna. Now, Jan van Eyck didn't invent that. This is a symbol that goes way, way back through the Middle Ages. In fact, what it stems from is from the Roman emperors. They would be portrayed holding an orb, a globe, or a sphere in their hand to show that they were the rulers of the entire world. And then that emblem of rulership becomes Christianized by placing a cross over it. So it's saying the cross surmounts the world or surmounts the universe. And it shows that Christ is the king or the emperor over all the world, over all the universe. It also might remind us of another verse in John that talks about the world, that refers to God's love for the world. For God so loved the world as to give his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him may not perish, but may have life everlasting. I want to show you again what Petrus Christus does with an Eichian model. And so I'm going to show you this. These panels that are in Berlin, and they are from the size and shape. We can say that these are two wings to an altarpiece. The center is missing. Whether it was a painting by Petrus Christus or someone else, or a carved Schnitz altar, a carved wooden altarpiece, we don't know. We don't know where these originally were. But in them, you can see things like the influence of Robert Campin, van der Weyden, and Jan van Eyck. And of course, you also see that simplification of forms and clarity of geometry, both in the space and in the volumes of the figures and other objects. I'm not going to do the actual comparison with Campin and Roger van der Weyden. I hope you can remember some of the Annunciations, like the Marotta altarpiece and the painting by Roger van der Weyden in the Louvre. And you'll see that this is much simplified. It doesn't have all of those little details that we thought might be symbolic, simply the standard ones, as it were. And here you can see that this is signed. But you can also see the Holy Family adoring the child with one of the midwives, presumably the midwife who believed in the virgin birth when she was told of it. But what I really want to do is compare the Last Judgment wing. Because this is so very clearly based on a Jan van Eyck or Jan van Eyck workshop, Last Judgment, that is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so let's compare them. What's the difference? Jan van Eyck has so much detail, just wealth of figures and things happening. Petrus Christus' version is simplified. He has much less detail than Jan van Eyck. He has reduced the number of figures. There's not as many people in hell, for one thing, or even as many people being resurrected. And he has this very clear distinction of spaces. Certainly it's clear with van Eyck, but you really do see this, foreground with the hell, and then the landscape seems to be very separate from the saints in heaven, and they almost seem like there's a kind of geometry about them. The footrest that the saints in heaven have, makes a really straight line pointing toward Christ up in heaven, and frames Saint Michael against the sky. So you have this very clear distinction of the different spaces. So then let's look a little bit at some of the details here from Petrus Christus. Another thing is to look at the way that Jan van Eyck created St. Michael the Archangel and the way Petrus Christus did. Obviously, there's so much more detail and color in the wings and the costuming of Jan van Eyck's warrior angel. But Petrus Christus has created a warrior angel, St. Michael the Archangel, dressed in contemporary armor. Jan van Eyck's was contemporary as well, but a little more exotic. This is, what you might see a 15th century warrior who was well-to-do, a knight, wearing, and he's battling. As you can see, he's about to strike down the devil. and I think the other little creature is supposed to be a basilisk. The skeleton that hovers over hell, representing death. That sin brought into the world and has become the fate of all mankind. But there's fewer people and devils in hell. It is dark, and it has this giant hell mouth spurting out fire, but is once again simplified. And there you see the very orderly ranks of the heavenly host, the saints as well as the angels, and Christ showing his wounds, showing that he died for mankind at the last judgment. He's presides over everyone's eternal fate, but he shows them, I gave you a chance. And there we are comparing Jan van Eyck's hell and Petrus Christus's much more simplified hell, with all these writhing and twisting and the tormented people. A very small painting, which must have been used for devotional purposes, is known as the Madonna of the Dry Tree. Now, there was a confraternity called the Confraternity of the Dry Tree, and both Petrus Christus and his wife were members of this confraternity. A confraternity is, I guess you could call it a religious club, maybe something like the Knights of Columbus or the Masons. In this case, of course, both males and females could be members. Some of them were very prestigious, and they were joined together for religious devotion. The dry tree that they refer to is the tree of life. And the tree of life was supposed to have withered when mankind first sinned. But when Christ comes back to redeem mankind, the tree will live again. In the imagery of Petrus Christus's painting, the crown of thorns seems to be growing out of a tree trunk. It becomes this dry tree. And it encircles the Virgin and Child like a wreath. Well, of course, the crown of thorns immediately reminds us of the passion of Christ and his suffering and his redemptive death. But some people also see in it a reference to the crown of Mary, which, of course, was not a crown of thorns, sometimes portrayed with even with roses. But Mary is the mother of God. She is the Queen of Heaven. She is the vehicle by which Christ entered the world. Sometimes they talk about the Rosenkranz, the rose crown of Mary, and this is related directly to the devotion of the Rosary. Now, when you look at this crown of thorns on the dry tree, you'll notice that there are little golden A's suspended from the branches. And if you count them, you'll find there are 15 of them. And the A's seem to stand for Ave, the angelic salutation, Ave gratia plena, hail thou who art full of grace, but also, of course, the opening words of the Ave Maria, the most popular prayer of the time, Ave Maria gratia plena, Dominis tecum. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. And during the 15th century, a new devotional practice grew up, and this is the practice of the Rosary. It was codified later in the century, but there were versions of it earlier. And during the Rosary, you have beads, which you can push off as you say each prayer, so you can count them. And you would count 15 Aves. You would say the Ave Maria 15 times, meditating on the life of Christ and Mary, on the infancy, on the sorrows of the Virgin, and on the glorification of the Virgin and the resurrection, and of course, Mary as Queen of Heaven. So, with this iconography, you are linking Mary and the Incarnation, the birth of Christ, to Christ's sacrificial death. Just one more Petrus Christus I want to show you. Petrus Christus as a portraitist. This is considered to be a late work, although it is not dated. And it shows you a lovely young lady with all that simplification of geometry and volume, but very diffuse lighting. And it spreads, it seems to be coming from perhaps an outside window and spreading over her face. And we don't see, well, she's too young to have wrinkles, but she does seem to be all smoothed over and generalized. So even the kind of detail that you might expect in a portrait of someone, we have that all smoothed over. She is more perfected, perhaps, but you can still see that feeling of the volume of the head. And of course, it was popular to pull your hair back and even to shave your brow, giving you much more beautiful curving brow line, much more egg-shaped, actually. And of course, once again, you can see the repetition of the curving shape in the collar, and then the geometry of this kind of triangular V shape in the bodice of the dress, and truncated cone in her beautiful, fashionable, I think that's probably velvet, but could be wool, I guess, headdress.